morning and welcome to the Daily Aus. It's Wednesday, the 1st of April. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Billi FitzSimons.
Happy April Fools.
Oh my God, true.
Yeah.
What's the joke?
No
Cost
joke.
of living. Except it's not a joke, it's real life.
It's real life. But what I hope for everyone today is that you don't get caught in some embarrassing prank.
And it is a good day because fuel is cheaper today.
From today, fuel is cheaper. Congratulations. That is no prank. That is the 100% real news truth. Now, it is one of a couple of big cost of living relief measures that have been announced this week, just over the last few days. And these are all initiatives promising to lower the price of our everyday life. That includes a ban on card surcharges, of course, the cheaper fuel that we're going to talk through. And we'll unpack all of that in today's deep dive. But first, here's a quick message from the TDA team.
Hello, my name is Sky. I am a partnerships manager at the Daily Aus, which put simply means I help bring in the money. A big part of my job is organising the ads for this podcast. TDA is an independent media company, which means we partly rely on the ads to grow our team, which in turn means that we can keep delivering you the news that makes sense. The best way you can help us is by pressing follow on whatever podcast platform you listen on, or giving us a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify is even better. And thank you for being part of the TDA community.
So Emma, I feel like it was during the pandemic that cost of living soared. Inflation was crazy. And then we had maybe about a 6-month period where kind of wages were increasing again and it seemed to be not getting better, but at least plateauing. And then now it seems to be at the center of every conversation again, I think mostly because of the war.
Yeah.
What's kind of the state of play when it comes to cost of living right now?
Well, cost of living relief and conversations about cost of living pressures are really front and center once again. Of course, they didn't disappear. You're absolutely right. We've been talking about cost of living on and off for 6 years, maybe 5 years at least. But thanks to this conflict in the Middle East, which has caused massive disruptions to global oil supplies, we've seen this flow-on effect. And, that is coupled with higher than expected inflation, which was already on the rise before the conflict. We've seen consecutive rate rises from the RBA, higher unemployment figures, stagnating growth. We're seeing increased redundancies. So all of that paints a lot of uncertainty in a picture of a cost of living era that is persisting. So now we have this other conflict in the Middle East that's just really added to, exacerbated all of that.
And so today we're going through 2 new measures that have been announced this week. The first is from the RBA, which is Australia's central bank.
Yep.
They have announced a ban on card surcharges.
Yes. Now, this is the extra fee when you tap your phone to pay for something or you tap your card or swipe your card. You will usually be charged about a 1% to 2% fee. Now, from October, that surcharge is going to be banned. This has been a long time coming. The RBA actually began looking into these surcharges in 2024. That was part of its own review in tackling the cost of living, and it's part of a broader shakeup of payments. So systems are going to be reformed broadly. That will include cutting interchange fees. That's the fee that businesses pay or that businesses pay banks for transactions. So there are changes coming for us as consumers, but also for businesses. Now, this is really significant, or the reason the RBA was looking into this is because card transactions have become such a prolific and prominent part of our everyday lives. Card transactions outpaced cash for the first time back in 2016. And since then, we've seen cash become less and less of a fixture in our daily lives, while, tap and go is pretty much it for most people, especially young people.
Yeah. It's funny talking about this as a cost of living measure, which I know is why the RBA did it. They have said that. And when we put this on the Daily Aus feed yesterday, I saw there were comments from people saying, oh, thank God now I can pay my rent. And I know that it's not a huge amount, but it is interesting to think about how much we would actually spend, because it does add up. You know, if you think about how much you're tapping your card every day, it does add up. If every single time you tap your card, there's an extra 20 cents there.
It adds up to around $60 a year on average per card using adult. But of course, you know, depending on your lifestyle and who you are and where you're at and how you interact with transactions, that could be a lot higher or a lot lower, you know, depending on who you are. But overall, it costs consumers about $1.2 billion a year. So that's the RBA's own modelling on what these surcharges cost. As I mentioned, it's about 1 to 2% in extra fees. The fee depends on the card used, on the merchant providing the transaction. Consumers pay, businesses pay. So, you know, MasterCard or Visa, for example, they will charge processing fees that we all absorb. What's interesting, though, that I learned researching this for today's episode, Billi, is that debit cards are actually cheaper to process than credit cards. So debit card, think your everyday savings account card that you use.
I did know this because when I switched to a credit card, I considered it, but I wanted the points.
Well,
I'm a bit of a points loyalist.
I'm glad that you brought up the points because there has been a bit of inequality here. So the point of sale system, the actual technology, the thing that you tap, it's very difficult for those things to tell the difference between a debit card and a credit card.
I was wondering this because when you tap your card, it already has the surcharge on the FPOS machine.
Yes.
So when we were saying that it is different for different cards, I've been thinking, but how do they know which one I'm going to use?
Well, thank you for asking. When I say debit cards are cheaper to process, it doesn't mean that debit card users are paying a lower fee. What ends up happening is transactions charge a blended fee for all card payments. And this creates this issue called cross-subsidization, where debit card users are essentially funding credit card spending. So debit card users are tapping and paying more so that you, Billi, can game the system and use your credit card and get your points for your frequent flyers.
Wow, I did not know that. I am sorry to all the debit card users out there.
But it really plays into, you know, why the RBA felt it was important to look into this and to have a real conversation about, is this fair? Are these fees necessary? So the RBA basically says that surcharging is not valid anymore. It's not achieving its original purpose, which was basically to encourage consumers to make more informed decisions about efficient payment methods. You know, back in the day, I think if you can remember, when we had the option to, you know, insert a chip, swipe a card, when tap and go or contactless wasn't as prolific. But contactless really is the method that so many of us have adopted. It's so convenient and quick, but that surcharge is no longer really proving its point or is no longer serving a purpose. For small businesses, we know that 9 in 10 owners believe that banks are actually profiting off these card processing fees. That's according to some research from AMP Bank Go. So businesses, consumers, we're all off it. None of us want the fees.
Hey, I'm Sam. I'm the co-founder of TDA. With one button, 82% of you who aren't subscribed to this YouTube channel can change that and help Australian media. Click subscribe. Now back to the video.
So, you said before that businesses and banks have potentially been profiting off these card surcharges. Now that those are banned, I presume they will no longer be able to do that. So how have they responded?
Well, it's a little bit complicated because you can ban the surcharges, but you can't ban a business from, say, increasing its prices by 1 to 2% to cover the costs that they may have to absorb from these transactions. So in a bid to kind of minimize that or reduce the chances of that happening, the RBA is capping fees that providers and banks can charge businesses. So Visa, MasterCard and banks will only be able to charge a certain amount of fees, and it's hoped that that will create higher transparency and ultimately pass on savings to businesses and consumers. The RBA is estimating that this could save businesses around $1.2 billion a year because there's been a cap on the fees that merchants can charge for the transactions.
It is interesting, that conversation of whether businesses will just now increase how much they are charging customers.
Yeah. And we have no say in it really, but Choice, the consumer group, has been really pushing for these reforms, and it also wants a review in the next 2 to 3 years, basically to ensure that the changes are having the intended effect. So they're calling for this kind of continuing monitoring to make sure that transactions do become cheaper and easier and more convenient for everyone involved, businesses and consumers alike.
I imagine that would be a hard thing to monitor because you can just increase your prices and say that it's because everything's getting more expensive that we have had to do this. And in order to actually pinpoint the exact cause of why something has gotten more expensive, wouldn't be an easy task.
Especially not when we're talking about a margin of 1 or 2%.
Yes.
But, there will be auditing and there will be very obvious paper trails between, what Visa, MasterCard and banks are charging to use the EFTPOS machines, what we are paying at the checkout and what businesses are taking home at the end of the day.
Okay, so that is card surcharges. That change is coming into effect in October, you said?
Yep.
And then also this week, completely separately, the government has announced that it will halve the fuel excise, which if you don't know what that is, fair enough, because it's a little known tax that we all pay every time we go to the petrol station.
Yeah, this has been a major story this week. I'm sure all of our listeners are well tuned in to the fuel crisis and what's going on. But a quick refresher, with the Middle East conflict, with the war between the US, Israel and Iran, we've seen the Strait of Hormuz cut off for most fuel tankers. The Strait of Hormuz is off the south of Iran's coast. About 20 to 25% of global oil is shipped through that vital shipping lane. So obviously that's been cut off since the 28th of February. Now the impact of that has been massive price increases to fuel around the world. We've been particularly hard hit in Australia with a lot of panic buying. For some context on where things are at, as of Monday, according to the NRMA, the average price for regular unleaded in Sydney was at $2.58 a litre. That increased by 14.5 cents in a week. Diesel has reached $3.23 per litre, up 11 cents in a week. Now in the regions, regular unleaded rose about 11 cents per litre in the week to Monday, but diesel soared 26.3 cents per litre on average in 1 week.
Wow.
So that gives you a sense of how intense this surge has gotten, how stressful and how much pressure it's put on not just drivers, but people and manufacturers and agriculture businesses and transport companies and vital transport services. So we've seen the conversation then push to, well, what can the government do to intervene here? Because things are blowing out so rapidly, something needs to change. That was, the argument from the opposition and many consumers and transport industry spokespeople. So the fuel excise is being halved for the next 3 months to lower petrol prices to deal with this intense inflation. The fuel excise specifically is a tax. It's easiest to think of it as a tax or a levy that's added to petrol. It's existed for well over 100 years. It's technically paid by manufacturers, but they pass it on to the customer.
That seems to be the trend of the episode.
Yeah.
Businesses passing on the cost. Which,
Absolutely.
they have to pay their bills too.
Capitalism, Billi. Many countries have an equivalent tax to the fuel excise here, so it's not just us. In the UK, they pay about $1 a litre extra on top of their fuel prices. The fuel excise in the US is about 20 cents per litre. So we sit somewhere in the middle. Until today, our fuel excise was 52.6 cents per litre of petrol. So that's how much extra we were paying. The government announced on Monday that that would be halved. This applies to petrol and diesel, so unleaded, diesel, both included, and that will reduce fuel costs by about 26.3 cents a litre from today, from Wednesday. In terms of what does that actually look like when you use your card to tap and go to pay for your petrol with your 1 to 2% surcharge, it'll reduce the cost of a 65 litre tank by about $20 a week, according to the Federal Treasurer.
That's quite a lot.
Yeah, so it is pretty significant. It will also ease the burden on farmers, transport, manufacturers, essential services. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has said that he does want this to flow on to those industries, and it's not just about drivers, that, we should still be mindful about our fuel consumption and use public transport where possible.
When we were doing the reporting on this and we looked at the fuel excise and how much it was, I was surprised to learn that it was 52.6 cents per litre, because I know that the government has done this before, or the government of the day has done this before, because the coalition did it to help the cost of living crisis, I think like 4 years ago or something.
March 2022, yeah.
There you go. And it was something like 40 cents. It was somewhere in the 40s. And I didn't realize that it had increased that much in just that short period.
Well, I mean, like any tax, inflation is applied.
Of course.
There are reviews and audits. These numbers tend to go up, and the fuel excise is no exception. So yeah, you're right. In 2022, it was sitting at about 44 cents a litre. That was during the early months of the Russia-Ukraine war. So after Russia invaded Ukraine, a lot of countries refused to purchase oil from Russia, at the time a significant supplier of the world's oil. That placed a massive strain on global supplies, very similar to what we're seeing now. And the coalition government at the time, you're right, halved the fuel excise. That was a decision it made to halve for 6 months. Right now, we're just looking at the next 3 months. But Angus Taylor himself, the opposition leader, urged the government to adopt this policy, citing 2022 and the then coalition government decision to do the same. At first, Albanese was a little bit cautious or hesitant to tell us which way he was leaning. But on Monday, he said, we're making fuel cheaper. We understand that Australians are under serious pressure. Now, that decision came out of National Cabinet when state and territory leaders met on Monday morning to talk about the next steps and how we can tackle this fuel crisis.
And so how do we think that will impact the economy? Will it make everything better?
Well, the opposition and the government both wanted the fuel excise halved. They're saying it won't put pressure on inflation. Plenty of economists are saying otherwise. I suppose the conversation has sort of split into, is it about relief immediately, or are we more concerned about the long-term economic impacts?
Quick question. With them saying that it won't impact inflation, won't it improve inflation? Because if inflation is about prices getting higher over time, this limits that by making petrol cheaper.
Well, the school of thought is that lower prices equal more consumption. So if petrol is cheaper and is so cheap that everyone makes the decision to go and fill up freely and readily, whenever they drive past a servo, that can lead to inflationary problems because it doesn't drive down spending. With petrol being as expensive as it is, we're seeing behavior change. We're seeing consumers become more reticent to go and fill up or make different decisions about how they get to work or where they're going to travel to over the Easter long weekend, or are they going to get a train?
But even with this decrease in petrol prices by 25 cents per litre or whatever it is, it's still, even with that discount, more expensive than it was prior to the war.
Significantly more expensive. And the NRMA has pointed to this. They've said that the fuel excise, the difference in, the tax change isn't really going to be that obvious immediately because prices are so high and continuing to rise. The halving of the fuel excise will be absorbed into that quickly, and we could still see unleaded, for example, surging towards $3 over the coming weeks or months per litre. So there's still going to be a lot of pain at the bowser. I did read some suggestions from a group of policy experts at Victoria University. They suggested that better designed relief could look like direct help to the people under the greatest pressure. So rather than subsidising fuel for all users, having direct payments to low-income households, for example, or targeted support for fuel-using industries and essential services. We saw something very similar in New Zealand, where the government there has announced a subsidy for low-income households. About 150,000 families in New Zealand will have access to about $50 a week to subsidise fuel costs at the moment. And that subsidy will be in place for a year or until petrol prices significantly turn around. So just some interesting policies and different approaches that we're seeing around the world. But in Australia, this is what we've got for now. And I'm sure it's relief to drivers everywhere, at least for the short term.
And we know that the Australian government is releasing its federal budget in May. You'll be in Canberra for that.
Yes, ma'am.
So it will be interesting to see if they announce any more cost of living measures for that. But until then, thank you, Em.
Thanks, Billi.
And thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus. You would have heard from Sky earlier in today's episode. We are really wanting to grow our podcast at the moment and wanting more young people to find us and find the news. So if you could press follow on whichever podcast platform that you are listening to this on, it would really help us. We'll be back later today with the headlines, but until then, we hope you have a lovely day.